Spain once held the planet in its grip. In the 16th century, it was not the British Empire that dominated the world map. It was Spain. For the first time in recorded history, a single crown commanded territories that spanned oceans and continents at once. Across Europe, along parts of Africa, through vast stretches of the Americas, and all the way into Asia. The reach was so enormous that observers began saying, "The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire," a phrase the British would later adopt for themselves. But built inside that triumph was a fatal contradiction. The wealthiest empire humanity had ever seen was ultimately wrecked by the very riches that made it powerful in the first place. And that matters now, because the logic behind its collapse hasn't gone away. Like Spain, people still confuse sudden flows of money with real, durable strength. And when that illusion breaks, the fall is always violent. After Spain crossed into the Americas in the wake of 1492, it tapped into what looked like an endless supply of fortune. Gold and silver, in amounts no European ruler had ever dreamed possible, poured into Spanish possession. The conquest of Mexico in 1521 crushed the Aztec Empire and delivered access to rich deposits in places like Zacatecas. Roughly a decade later, the invasion of Peru shattered the Inca Empire and exposed Potosi, a mountain of silver so immense and so lethal to the laborers forced to mine it that people called it the mountain that eats men. For more than 100 years, Potosi and other mines in the Americas supplied a non-stop stream of bullion. Treasure fleets loaded in the New World and crossed the Atlantic again and again, feeding Spain what appeared to be an inexhaustible river of precious metal. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain extracted and shipped home an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and around 2,000 tons of gold. To understand how extreme that is, that was more silver than the rest of Europe had collectively dug out of the ground in the previous 1,000 years. This wasn't just an internal Spanish windfall, it changed the balance of power globally. The metal leaving the Americas didn't simply sit in Spanish vaults. From ports such as Seville and Cadiz, Spanish convoys pushed bullion outward in every direction, into the Mediterranean economies, into the Low Countries, and even across the Pacific into Manila. In Manila, Spanish silver was exchanged directly for Chinese silk and porcelain. This circulation of metal tied Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas together into a single economic network. It was effectively the birth of a globalized economy, and Spain was positioned at the center of it. For people in the modern United States, the timeline is jarring. In 1607, when Jamestown was founded, a fragile English settlement barely surviving in a mosquito-ridden swamp, Spain already presided over established imperial cities. Mexico City already had universities, printing presses, and grand cathedrals. Lima was not a struggling outpost. It was a major city. St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, stands as the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, more than 40 years before Jamestown. The comparison is direct. While England's first lasting colony in North America was still fighting off starvation and disease, Spain was already administering cities, building stone architecture, and imposing imperial systems across multiple continents. Spain was not simply ahead in discovery. It was already operating a global machine, while England and France were still failing repeatedly to plant successful colonies. And yet, beneath the surface of that empire, beneath the endless flow of plundered bullion, there was structural weakness. Spain committed a basic economic mistake. It started treating treasure as if it were the same thing as productive wealth. The precious metals were undeniably real, the ships were real, the mines were real. But how that inflow of metal was handled slowly turned power into fragility. Inside Spain, prices surged. Over the course of the 1500s, inflation ran so hot that the cost of basic goods roughly quadrupled in just a century. Ordinary Spaniards found daily necessities like bread and clothing harder to afford. At the exact same time that their empire was supposedly richer than any state in Europe. The reason comes down to how money works. Currency only keeps its value when it is limited enough to be trusted. When massive amounts of gold and silver are dumped into an economy, but the number of goods and services doesn't grow at the same pace, each coin starts to lose purchasing power. Picture a small town where a loaf of bread costs 1 coin. Now, imagine that 10 times more coins suddenly flood into that town. But the number of bakers doesn't increase, and the number of loaves of bread doesn't change. Everyone is holding more coins, but the amount of bread is the same. The bakers simply raise their prices. Soon bread costs 2 coins, then 3, then 4. The bread hasn't improved, the coin has weakened. That is the dynamic that gripped Spain. Historians call it the price revolution, the first major wave of large-scale inflation in early modern Europe, triggered in large part by too much New World silver chasing too few goods. But those rising prices didn't hit every layer of society evenly. The people who were closest to the silver when it arrived, high nobility, major merchants, large banking interests, could take advantage of newly arrived bullion while prices were still relatively low. They could buy land, secure assets, and pay down obligations before the broader economy adjusted. Meanwhile, wages for most workers did not keep up. The majority of Spaniards lived on fixed incomes or slow-moving pay, and as prices climbed, their money stretched less and less. The result was bleak. The more silver Spain shipped in, the more daily life eroded for average people. What should have been an obvious blessing behaved more like a slow-acting poison. The empire's flow of treasure made Spain look rich on paper, while it was quietly corroding the stability of its own domestic economy. And the damage went beyond inflation. Spain also failed to convert its inflow of precious metal into long-term productive capacity. Instead of pouring its wealth into strong local industries, the crown used the American treasure to buy what it wanted from other countries. Italian merchants, Dutch traders, German craftsmen, and other foreign suppliers prospered by selling goods, from weapons to textiles to luxury items, to Spain. Those bills were paid in silver mined in Mexico and Peru. As a result, Spain neglected the work of building competitive internal manufacturing, supply chains, and commercial infrastructure. Why pour effort into building efficient industries at home when the next treasure fleet would supposedly cover every expense? Spain drifted into the role of a consumer rather than a producer, while its rivals reinvested what they could capture, trade for, or steal. Those rivals were building banks, merchant networks, and naval power. Spain was buying finished goods. And on top of that, Spain's rulers spent staggering amounts of money fighting wars. The Habsburg dynasty saw itself as the sword and shield of Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation, and that self-appointed mission was incredibly expensive. Silver from the New World was used to fund wars against the Ottoman Empire, pay armies to crush the Dutch revolt, and intervene in the religious struggles tearing apart France. Spain also poured money into the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts Europe had ever endured, where Catholic and Protestant powers bled each other across the continent. The famous Spanish Armada of 1588, the massive fleet assembled to strike Protestant England, was built with American silver, and when that invasion force failed, the financial strain on the Spanish crown was immediate. So, where did all that treasure end up? The truth is that it disappeared into fleets, garrisons, interest payments, and promises that could not always be honored. Spain was not just spending what had already been unloaded on its docks. The crown was also borrowing heavily against silver that hadn't even crossed the Atlantic yet. Wealthy German banking families, such as the Fuggers, and later, powerful Genoese financiers, extended massive lines of credit to the Spanish monarchy. Those loans were secured by future shipments of bullion. On the surface, this looked clever. The mines at Potosi, along with other mines in Mexico and Peru, appeared so productive that it seemed safe to assume the flow of silver would never dry up. The treasure fleets would keep sailing, loans would be repaid, and Spain's position would remain secure. In reality, the strategy was dangerously fragile. If a shipment was delayed, or hit a storm, or was intercepted, the crown couldn't meet its obligations. And that happened often enough to trigger disaster. Spain defaulted on its debts again and again in the 16th century, in 1557, in 1575, in 1596, and in 1607. Think about what that means. The most powerful empire on earth, flush with historic levels of gold and silver, was still falling into bankruptcy on a recurring cycle of roughly every couple of decades. That is how deep the financial instability ran. And into this already unstable situation came the privateers. These weren't just freelance raiders chasing glory. They were instruments of economic warfare. England and the Netherlands understood that Spain's lifeline was its treasure convoys. If you attack those convoys, you don't just steal some cargo. You punch a hole in the Spanish state's ability to pay its creditors. Francis Drake, operating with official support from Queen Elizabeth, circumnavigated the globe in the 1580s and plundered so much Spanish treasure that his haul amounted to nearly half of England's annual revenue. Piet Hein, a Dutch privateer, captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba in 1628, a seizure worth about 11 million guilders. That single event nearly broke Spain's finances again. Each time a treasure convoy was lost, the impact was immediate across the entire system. Spain had already promised much of that silver to creditors before it even left the New World. So, when storms, ambushes, or raids took a fleet down, Spanish credit collapsed, and lenders from Antwerp to Genoa felt the shock. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands did not simply spend what they had stolen, they reinvested it. They used captured Spanish silver to finance naval buildup, to strengthen banking systems, and to fund commercial companies that would go on to shape future empires. The same mechanism that Spain treated as a lifeline, the treasure fleet model, became the precise weakness that its enemies attacked over and over. The Spanish crown could, in theory, have taken a different path. It could have used the constant flood of bullion to lay the groundwork for a self-sustaining economy. It could have focused on domestic industry, incentivized innovation, or created a broad, rational tax structure that gathered revenue from across the empire, instead of leaning almost entirely on silver streams from the Americas. But that did not happen. Instead, the monarchy behaved as if the mines would always produce, as if the treasure ships would always arrive, as if the cycle would continue forever. By the middle of the 1500s, Spanish rulers had locked themselves into a habit, borrowing aggressively against silver that hadn't even reached Europe yet. The pattern repeated endlessly. Banking houses, first the Fuggers and then major Genoese networks, loaned enormous sums in exchange for guaranteed pieces of upcoming shipments. The expectation was simple. Treasure would land in Seville, debts would be paid, and then the crown would immediately start borrowing again against the next wave of silver. Built into that model, however, was a fatal risk. If anything disrupted the flow, storms, piracy, naval defeat, Spain instantly faced a liquidity crisis. And when it couldn't pay, it defaulted. The 16th century saw four major royal bankruptcies: 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Imagine ruling an empire that controlled huge portions of the New World's mineral wealth, and still having to tell the world's most important financiers, again and again, "We can't pay you." War spending drove much of that desperation. The Habsburg rulers of Spain weren't only monarchs. They saw themselves as custodians of Catholic order after the Protestant Reformation. That role consumed treasure on a massive scale. Silver-financed Mediterranean campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, attempts to keep the rebellious Dutch under control, and confrontations with Protestant England. The Spanish Armada of 1588 alone cost millions of ducats, the modern equivalent of billions. And when that invasion failed to topple England, the financial hit was brutal, and it did not stop there. The 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648 and tore Europe apart, devoured Spanish bullion at a terrifying rate. One more layer of damage made the situation even worse. Most of the money didn't stay in Spain. The silver passed through Spain and then flowed outward. Italian shipbuilders were paid, Flemish merchants were paid, German bankers were paid. Foreign suppliers and contractors, many of them from regions that would soon become Spain's economic and military rivals, were enriched steadily. Spain's economy was structured around consuming other people's production instead of building its own depth. Every arrival of a treasure convoy in Seville meant that foreign creditors were satisfied first, while Spain's own internal economic base thinned out. By depending on imports and on foreign lenders, the crown eroded its internal resilience and trapped itself in a cycle of dependence that only got harder to escape with time. All of this fed into a final vulnerability: Spain's reliance on massive treasure convoys as the core of its financial system. These fleets, which carried precious metal from ports like Veracruz and moved through hubs like Havana on the way to Spain, weren't just shipments in a commercial sense. They were essentially payroll for the empire. They carried the bullion that Spain needed in order to pay the people it owed. Each convoy was a single point of failure. Losing one did not just hurt, it created crisis. The 1628 raid by Piet Hein, when a Dutch privateer seized an entire Spanish treasure fleet worth over 11 million guilders near Cuba, is a perfect illustration. That single loss shattered confidence in Spain's ability to make good on its promises. English privateers like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, sanctioned by their government, followed the same playbook: piracy as an arm of state policy. Capturing a Spanish galleon wasn't treated as random theft. It was understood as a strike against the Spanish crown's credit. England and the Netherlands then used what they took, not just for short-term spending, but to strengthen their navies, expand their banking frameworks, and build corporations that would anchor future empires. Spain had designed an imperial economy that depended on the uninterrupted safe arrival of those fleets. Its rivals were building systems that could generate wealth even without a single captured treasure ship. That made Spain uniquely exposed. When a convoy arrived safely, past debts could be paid down and the system could stumble forward. When a convoy failed to arrive, the entire imperial machine lurched toward panic, emergency borrowing, or outright default. By the early 1600s, Spain still looked overwhelming when you studied a map. Its banners flew across massive parts of the Americas, across key European territories, and into the Pacific world. Its monarchs lived amid obvious luxury, and its cathedrals and palaces glittered with objects taken from conquered lands. But under that display, the empire was financially brittle. Inflation had eaten away living standards at home. Constant borrowing left the monarchy chained to outside creditors. Piracy and naval interception had turned Spain's greatest supply route into a source of constant danger. For regular Spaniards, the idea that their kingdom was unimaginably wealthy did not match their reality. Prices climbed, wages lagged, taxes rose to fund wars that never seemed to end. The empire that boasted of limitless silver was, in practice, slowly consuming itself to survive. While Spain struggled under the weight of its own treasure, other powers were studying its example and taking notes. The English, the Dutch, and eventually the French recognized a critical point. Bullion by itself does not guarantee lasting dominance. Spain had built an imperial model based on extraction. Colonies were designed to pull value out: forced labor in mines, tribute, shipments of raw wealth, and then funnel that value back to Europe. Those colonies were not supposed to become balanced, self-growing economies. They were meant to feed Spain. It was an economy of plunder. Britain moved in a different direction. Its colonies in North America did not sit on endless piles of gold or silver, but they did produce goods with repeatable, compounding value: tobacco, sugar, timber, and later cotton. Those commodities fueled trade, manufacturing, and finance. Instead of relying mainly on state-run treasure convoys, Britain leaned on chartered companies like the East India Company and nurtured financial institutions in London. Dutch merchants built something similar. They developed the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, refined systems of credit and trade, and turned their navy into a tool of commercial expansion. These competitors did not stand around waiting for a silver convoy. They built systems capable of creating wealth continuously, and whenever they managed to redirect Spanish silver by seizing it at sea, by capturing it in war, or by drawing it through trade, they used it to strengthen those systems. That reinvestment allowed them to accumulate long-term power, even as Spain was hollowing itself out. This marks the deepest contrast. Spain measured its strength in terms of how much treasure it controlled. England and the Dutch Republic measured strength in terms of systems: banking, trade, production, institutions that could keep generating value year after year. One model is finite, the other can scale, and history shows which model endured. By the mid-1600s, Spain's downward slide was obvious. The once dreaded Armada, the symbol of Spanish naval supremacy, was weakened and diminished. Inflation at home, repeated bankruptcies, and constant financial distress had eroded trust in the crown's ability to govern responsibly. The 30 Years' War drained its treasury. The Dutch revolt succeeded, and the Dutch Republic emerged as an independent commercial power. England's navy was strengthening. London's financial networks were growing more sophisticated, and English influence was rising. Spain still owned massive territories on paper, but it struggled to fund, defend, and develop them. The superpower that had terrified Europe in the 16th century had, by the 18th century, turned into a fading giant. But the collapse of Spain's dominance is not only a story about kings, ships, and silver. It's a story about the danger of mistaking fast money for lasting prosperity. When a society is suddenly flooded with capital, whether that capital comes from plundered mines, or from aggressive borrowing, or from large-scale monetary expansion, the first instinct is almost always to spend it, to leverage it, and to assume the flow will continue. That is the trap Spain walked into. Without using that inflow to build real productive strength at home, the money began to rot the structure from the inside. Spanish peasants lived the consequences directly. They watched convoys arrive in Seville, loaded with treasure taken from across the ocean, and still found that basic food like bread had become harder to buy as prices shot up. In the modern world, people who save and work wages see a similar pattern when inflation quietly drains their purchasing power, even while governments insist the overall economy is strong. The mechanics aren't identical, but the effect feels familiar. There's another echo. Spain's treasure fleets concentrated value into a handful of giant, highly visible convoys. That concentration created obvious targets. If one fleet went down, to a storm, to an ambush, to a privateer like Piet Hein, the shock could rattle Spain's entire financial system because so much of its ability to make payments was tied to that one shipment. The 1628 capture of a full treasure fleet off Cuba, worth more than 11 million guilders, sent that kind of shock through Spain's credit structure in a single stroke. Today, wealth is often concentrated in different kinds of fragile points. Huge financial institutions, massive banks labeled too big to fail, debt structures that depend completely on confidence not evaporating. When one of those pillars cracks, the damage spreads fast. One failure can trigger cascading instability. Spain's experience shows that this vulnerability is not new. A single loss could expose the fragility of an entire empire. The conclusion is blunt. Treasure is not the same thing as real wealth. Silver is not the same thing as long-term safety. Durable prosperity comes from building systems that keep creating value. Productive industries, resilient institutions, and structures that can absorb shocks. Spain controlled more precious metal than any kingdom had ever touched, and still drove itself into repeated bankruptcy, because it believed that global reach and endless silver shipments guaranteed permanent strength. In reality, what it built was fragility. Its rivals understood the deeper rules and used Spain's own treasure to build the future. History doesn't copy itself exactly, step for step, but the rhythm is unmistakable. The richest empire of its age fell apart because it confused treasure for wealth. Any society that repeats that mistake, flooding itself with money while letting its foundations erode, is following the same trajectory. The issue is not whether the pattern exists. The question is whether we can recognize the warning in time. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.